But I'm here to introduce our afternoon speaker to talk about housing options. Housing is probably one of the biggest and scariest pieces ahead of us in the future. We're always looking at, so where is my kid going to live? How are they going to live there, and how am I going to make that happen? So as a result, we have brought down an expert from Washington, D.C., from the ARC of the United States. She works on our public policy staff, and she is going to bring all the information into a clear picture. She does have a PowerPoint, and we'll ask lots of questions, but Nicole has been with the ARC. How many years have you been there?
4, a little over 4, yeah.
4 years with the ARC of the United States, and she is a sibling. And so she will tell you a little bit more about herself and her journey to get here. But this is the time to start learning about housing. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And I know they're working on getting my PowerPoint up. So in the meantime, I will just do a little. Oh, there we go. And then I think this works. Let's see. That doesn't work, I don't think, but I can't click it. There we go. No. Anyway, I will do a brief introduction. As I said, my name is Nicole Jorwick. I'm the Senior Director of Public Policy for the ARC. I am also a sibling. My brother Chris will be turning 30 in just a couple days, and I'm actually headed back to Chicago for his big party. So I have experienced all of the things that we're going to be talking about from the perspective of a professional, but also as a family member. In addition, before I joined the ARC, I ran the Employment First Initiative for the state of Illinois, and before that I practiced special education law, helping families get the services that they need for their family members in school. And so I'm going to, again, bring all those kind of perspectives and experiences. Oh, good. It's working now. Thank you. So the picture with me, that's my brother Chris. And the other picture is actually before my brother Chris was even born. I've been really lucky that because of the work that families before mine did, I was in one of the first included classrooms in my school district. And so the other picture is my friend Sam, who I've known since I was 5. And it's why I know that these opportunities for inclusion and the opportunities for making sure that people have the lives that they choose are really important. So when we're talking about housing, we have to talk about historically. We know that families were told that the best place for children with disabilities, and by historically I mean it never is far from my mind that if my brother was born 30 or 40 years before, that he very well may have ended up in an institution, or families often kept family members at home. And obviously caregiving at home is still something that is going on, but we obviously see a big push for community living. The ARC, actually, for those who are not familiar with the ARC of the United States, it was founded by families like mine and Pat's 70 years ago. Next year will be our 70th anniversary, who wanted more than what doctors and other professionals were telling them. But obviously we still have a long way to go. These are some numbers about where people are living. These numbers are always changing, and I will say that the disability world is what I sometimes lovingly refer to as the data-free zone. Sometimes we're really good at figuring out scientific data and that sort of things, but when it comes to where people are actually being served, it's something that we have a hard time capturing. So I just want to give that caveat with any number. Before we can talk about housing, we really can't talk about that without talking about funding. Who is familiar with the Medicaid program? Okay, good. It's more than I'm used to. That's good. Medicaid is so much more than a healthcare program. It is pretty much the only game in town when it comes to funding what we call, not by we call, I mean what the law calls long-term services and supports. Hi. Long-term services and supports are the services, funding services to support individuals in their residential life, to support day programs. Those are to support people to live at home. But long-term services is a broad spectrum. So it's not just the home and community-based services, it's also other funding streams for other types of settings that I'll get into a little bit more later. Medicaid at its foundation is a state and federal partnership. It is federal, it is state money. The state makes a decision, every state budget makes a decision, the state legislators and the governor's office make a decision about how much money they're going to spend that year on Medicaid. And they know because of a pre-negotiated, a pre-developed rate, how much federal dollars are going to come in at a match. It's called the federal matching percentage. The FMAP varies state to state. It's always over 50%. So anytime you hear Medicaid, you should know that it's at state and federal partnership. It's state and federal dollars to flow through to support health care and long-term services and supports and everything else that Medicaid covers. It's also really important to know that those funds, why there are waiting lists. And one of the reasons for that is because in the Medicaid law, there are some services that are mandatory for states. And so the federal law oversees where the states can spend money. There are some things that are mandatory and there are some things that are optional. The mandatory services include those healthcare services, the institutional settings for people with disabilities are mandatory, but home and community-based services, the services that my brother get for his community-based day program, those sort of things, those are optional. There's nothing, we are working to change that in DC, but that's the reason that there's waiting lists, because states have to provide institutions, but it's optional to provide the home and community-based services. So in my home state of Illinois, that's the state that I can use as the easiest examples because I know the numbers. In my home state of Illinois, there are still 7 institutions that serve people with disabilities. Can I ask a question actually, because I'm doing this for a reason because of some internal work that we're doing. How many of you knew that people with disabilities still live in institutions? Okay, more than I thought. Okay. I asked the question because it's really important to understand that because that's where a bulk of the funding is going. Community-based services has an average cost of about $55,000 a year, whereas institutional services are over $200,000 a year. That's not why the ARC supports community living. The ARC supports community living because it provides better outcomes. We have decades of data that shows the lives of people with disabilities are better when they're served in the community. But also there is a financial reality to that. As I said, Medicaid does provide the health care. And it's important to know and understand because Medicaid comes up a lot when we're talking about politics, which is not what I'm here to talk to you about today, thank goodness. But it is just important to understand that when we talk about the costs of Medicaid, one of the biggest costs of Medicaid are those long-term services and supports. About 44% of Medicaid spending is for those long-term services and supports for people with disabilities and for aging Americans. And so we have to know that because when we have cuts that are coming to that program, that's where they're going to go directly. So it's really important to kind of understand that. It's also really important and really confusing because Medicaid is called a lot of different things in every different state. During 2017, there were some proposals around the health care bill that included significant cuts to the Medicaid program. And I would get phone calls from constituents who would say, well, I don't have to worry about that. My son or daughter's on the waiver. It's a Medicaid waiver. And I'm not saying that to fault the family members who thought that, but it's all of our responsibilities as family members to understand what these things mean so that if they're under attack or if we have to fight to increase capacity, which means increasing money, we have to understand that. So in Tennessee, it's called 10 Care. In Wisconsin, it's called Badger Care, but it's all Medicaid. And so it's just really important to kind of have that base level of understanding. And again, the reason that is because there have been proposals, including we anticipate in the next couple weeks some things coming out of the administration around this about changing the fundamental structure of Medicaid. When I say that, what I'm talking about is that I talked about how state government knows that if they're going to invest this amount of funds into the Medicaid program, they're guaranteed that match from the federal government. It doesn't matter if they have 10,000 more people that need services, and then that's going to cost the state more money, but they also know they're going to get that additional federal match. There were proposals to change that Medicaid guarantee in the form of per capita caps and block grants. I'm not going to go into that today, but if you have any questions, I could give speeches on that in my sleep, unfortunately. But that would eliminate that guarantee. So if you think about a state like Florida or a state like Michigan that had the lead water crisis or the Zika outbreak, that increased the number of Medicaid dollars that had to be spent on health care. Well, that state knew that they were going to have those funds come in from the federal government to offset it. If that guarantee is taken away, that wouldn't happen, which would mean that those optional services that I talked about earlier, that's the first place that the cuts are going to happen. I can't tell you how many meetings I had in 2017 with legislators on both sides of the aisle saying, we support home and community-based services. We've supported it for 20 years. And I would say, well, there's nothing in any of these proposals that changes that mandatory versus optional structure. And so the first, states won't have a choice. I heard a state director of Developmental Disability Services say that they were going to have to cut their whole home and community-based services program. That was the reality, and that's why it's really important that as family members we understand that and understand where the funds are coming from. So I just threw a lot at you about Medicaid. Do I have any questions? Okay. It's okay. Correct. Yeah. So the question was if a state, so we'll use Kentucky because we're in Kentucky. If the state of Kentucky decided that they were going to invest $1 million for providing home and community-based services, that $1 million would be matched, and then they would have $2 million to provide those services. Another question? Sure. A great place to go is thearc.org, which is our website /joinourfight. If you do that, you're going to get updates on what's happening with pieces of legislation. You'll get our action alerts about pieces about legislation that's moving, including we have some materials around what's going on for August for recess, because all your legislators will be home if you don't already know that. TheArc, THEARC.org /joinourfight. My advocacy director will be very happy I had the opportunity to give that out. Any other questions about Medicaid generally? And actually our website has a lot of other resources around Medicaid and some I'd like to think simply stated things because we helped develop them during 2017. And my email address will also be at the end, and so always feel free to reach out to me. So that is Medicaid, and I talked about how Medicaid is broken down into mandatory versus optional services, and some of those optional services are home and community-based services. The home and community-based services recently, not that recently actually, in 2014, a rule came out, the Hcbs settings rule. How many folks have heard of the Hcbs settings rule? That's fine. It helps me to know where I start. So the home and community-based settings rule came out in 2014 with a 5-year transition period. The rule was about one simple thing. It's about making sure that community-based dollars are actually being spent in the community. As I said, these are optional funds. It's actually a relatively small piece of the pie when it comes to financial terms. And so it was about making sure home and community-based services were created in the 1980s under President Reagan, the waiver system. And that was a waiver out of institutional care. And the waiver systems were created, and there were plenty of places in the country where a place that was providing something that was more institutional-based just changed the name over their door and kept providing the same type of services and started receiving home and community-based service funds. I don't say that with any ill intent, it's just what happened. And so the rule came out after 10 years of rulemaking. So there was 10 years. The governmental process is really boring, I can tell you that after living it for the last 4 years. But it's because it gives people a lot of opportunities to provide their input. So over it was 9.5 years of rulemaking, this rule was put out. And what the rule is about, again, making sure those home and community-based dollars are stay in the community, and also making sure that they are being spent on services that the individual chooses. There are still on other, so this applies to all home and community-based services. The other funding streams still remain. So there's still the mandatory funding streams. That's a funding stream that funds things like nursing homes, institutions, and ICFs. ICFs are intermittent care facilities for individuals with DD. And also that reminds me, I live in a world of alphabet soup, so if I use an acronym, Pat or someone else just throw something at me. But those other funding streams still remain, and the rule doesn't apply to them. The rule, again, only applies to home and community-based services. And what it does is it also requires person-centered planning. It requires that an individual is at the center to whatever their ability is to be a part of their planning for how they're spending their days. We want to make sure that individuals are not just going to a place where everybody's doing one thing without input from the group, that sort of thing, that things are individualized as much as possible, and also that individuals have the opportunity for something called non-disability specific settings. That individuals have the choice of a non-disability specific setting. What that means, an example of that would be a youth center, a senior center, a local gym. These are non-disability specific settings. They're places that are not just set up for people with disability to go to. There's been a great deal of, they put in the rule with a 5-year transition period because we knew that, I wasn't part of it, the government knew that there would be a need to transition. There would be a need for service providers. The ARC has a majority of advocacy chapters, but we also have a great amount of service provider chapters. So those are the chapters that are working with families, providing group home services, providing day programs, that sort of thing. And a lot of those service providers had invested in buildings, had invested in service systems that would need some time to come into compliance with the rule, which is why there's this 5-year transition. So that 5 years ended in March. States had to make plans to how they would come into compliance with the rule, how they would offer these types of services. We're not there yet. Even though the time period has ended, only 15 states have their full approval. My home state and a few others haven't even gotten their initial approval. And so if you're not already involved with the home and community-based services or the home and community-based implementation process in your state, you should connect with your local ARC chapter or the DD Council or other folks in your state who might be a little more tuned in, because it's really important to keep an eye on what's going on. Because the home and community-based settings rule also requires states to go in and make sure that they're looking at the right things, that they're building the right kinds of, service system. And that's not just about buildings, it's also about rules and regulations and whether or not they're actually looking at outcomes that matter, that they're not just looking where the exit sign is, but that we're actually looking at personal outcome measures for people. That's a little bit of a taster on the rule. Any questions on that one? Okay. Now we're going to get to the meat and potatoes. Go ahead.
Self-determination and like kind of reporting you might have to do, managing that.
The question was about self-determination. The home and community-based settings rule certainly should be, the only thing that the rule should be doing is helping with self-determination. Because the states have to develop new person-centered planning processes that are, again, centered around the individual. It requires that an individual have things like a choice of a roommate, how to decorate their room. Again, the rule kind of does things that you would assume are already happening, and I know in a lot of places already are, but it's about making sure that rising tides lift all boats, and that everyone has that access no matter what where they're living or what their needs are. And also, I do want to highlight that the rule does not eliminate any settings. It just provides characteristics for what is community-based and what is not. And if something is presumed not to be community-based, then the state has to go through a different review process. It doesn't mean that it can't meet it. It just means that they have to go through it's called heightened scrutiny, which I kind of call the second look. But that's a state process. And I just wanted to also mention that it's about individuals with disabilities having access to individuals without disabilities, their non-disabled peers, at the same rate that anybody else living in the same area would have. That's just important because we get a lot of questions about rural areas and other things like that, and obviously, I live in the center of Washington, D.C. My brother's not going to have the same access to individuals in Illinois that I would have in DC. So it's not comparing everybody to one thing, it's comparing folks to individuals that are in their community. So when it comes to housing, obviously we talked about the funding stream. So when I'm talking about the funding streams, Medicaid does not fund residential services. It funds the services, it does not pay for the room and board. That's really important. Medicaid does not pay room and board, it does pay for the services. And there has been a big movement that's very important about moving services away from the actual location of living, because a lot of times there was a big push to different groups owning things and also providing the services. Having more housing options kind of breaks that apart, which hopefully will be a benefit to everyone. So the housing, it's called the Housing and Urban Development Department. That's the department of the government that runs the HUD program, or the government agency that oversees Section 811 and a lot of the housing programs that can provide funds. So I talked about Medicaid, that provides funds for the services, and now we're going to talk about housing, which is about where it can actually pay for the bricks and mortar. There have been growth, and this is what some of this slides shows. It's really important to note that the Fair Housing Act, which is the biggest piece of legislation that supports non-discrimination in housing, but also supports housing generally, is the Fair Housing Act. And disability is one of the listed protected classes. And I think it's important because it is a listed protected class, but it's not somewhere where a lot of developers are putting a lot of attention, although I will say that I've seen that changing in the last 10 years, but it's important that we make sure as families that it's changing in the right direction. So disability is one of the original categories, and these are just some additional resources that I can leave up if any, and I'm sure I'm happy to have anyone have access to these, but these are just some where you can look by your state and by your locality at some programs that exist. So the Section 811 has actually only in the last 5 years has gone through a great deal of change, and part of that is because when it first came around, and let me take a giant step back and say what Section 811 is the first supported housing program that the government put out, and it provided capital grants and operating subsidies for nonprofits housing groups. So community support, there's community supportive housing groups, there's your state housing agency. These are all, these can all help connect you to other nonprofits that are in the space. And in the mid-1990s, Section 811 was producing about 3,000 plus units per year. But it really became a difficult to maintain program, and that was because of things like the price per unit. When you actually got to everything, they weren't actually linking the housing to the supports like I talked about. It's good to have them separate, but you have to link them together. You can't just build units and then not have individuals have the support. And I talked about waiting lists, so there's almost 1 million people all over the country depending on where you are on waiting lists. And so you can build all of these places that are compliant with the Section 811 program, but if you have a person who's on a waiting list for 10 years that doesn't have the funds to support them in that unit. So that's some of what we saw. We also saw a troubling move to disability-only housing. And I know that that's something that's sometimes appealing to some folks, and there is a funding stream for that, the mandatory ICF funding stream that I talked about. But when we're talking about anything that the government is putting funds in through Section 811, it has to be a scattered site model, so there have to be individual, if there are units that are delegated for individuals with disabilities, there also have to be units that are delegated for people without disabilities. And so what we saw was some changes in how it was moved. We did see some benefits of the Section 811 program with coming into compliance with the Olmstead decision. For those who might not know, which is probably most because it's a little wonky, but For anybody who doesn't know, today is actually the 29th birthday of the Americans with Disabilities Act, so that's exciting. And the Americans with Disabilities Act was the first civil rights legislation, and so far only civil rights legislation geared at non-discrimination for people with disabilities. And what the Olmstead was a Supreme Court decision that used the Americans with Disabilities Act to say that individuals who did not want to live in segregated settings have the right to live in the community. And so the increase in housing vouchers did help to do a lot of things in states that had settlement agreements, including my home state of Illinois has a settlement agreement around Olmstead, and that means that they worked with their housing authority to make sure that there were units that were integrated in the community where people who were leaving institutions because they chose to back into the community, that they had those resources. So they did see a drop in what was going on with 811. They weren't creating as many units. The units that were being created weren't necessarily being used for in the way that they should have been. And so that there was the Melville Supported Housing Investment Act of 2010, and it authorized major reforms to the Section 811 program. It created Project Rental Assistance Program, which is a long-term supply of project-based permanent supportive housing. So what this means in layman's terms is that it created a more permanent model of providing some subsidies for rent. Because we know that because of Medicaid, and this is something I should have mentioned earlier, Medicaid is a means-tested benefit. That means you can only have so much money, can only be at a certain point over the poverty line in order to qualify. And that will mean that individuals, that's how they also the same poverty line as far as access to Social Security benefits, those sort of things. So we have to make sure that the rental subsidies also stay around, because or else people will be priced out of housing. And so that's one thing that this bill did. It also made sure it put some of the concerns that they were seeing around integration. It requires that no more than 25% of units can have occupancy for people with disabilities, and it's a much more cost-effective and efficient model. As we talked about before 2010, when they made these changes, they were creating units, but it was at a very high cost per unit. Oh, yep, go ahead.
So, okay. So if you go back to the Olmstead Act, so I kind of had a question, just if we go down a level. So I'm assuming that the Olmstead Act, we're specifically talking about kind of the state of Georgia that was listed up there. Is that specifically for kind of like rentals, like rental facilities, and does it also impact what HOAs can say inside of their communities? Say if we decided to take our child and put it into a home and have caregivers come in and take care of her, how does that kind of work with
How does that protect us? And that
Yeah.
keeps it out of the neighborhood.
in terms of being in the neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
Does the Homestead Act kind of cover us at that point, not only for the state level, but also HOAs?
Sure. So I just want to clarify, it's not the Olmstead Act. It's,
Okay.
it's just, and that's it's a Supreme Court decision.
Yep.
And the Olmstead decision does not have to do with housing. It has to do with the services piece that I was talking about.
Okay.
And so, but the model that you're talking about you're talking about having staff coming into your own home, or staff going into a home where?
So our goal is for her to live on her own.
Yes.
So we want her to have a home.
Yes.
And we want staff to come in
Yeah. and
to
it-
her home.
Yes, that's perfectly allowable under Olmstead. That's exactly
Okay.
what Olmstead, that's
Perfect.
exactly
That's what we
Olmstead-
figured, just wanted to make sure.
Okay.
We've heard a lot of different conversations about it and how HOAs handle it, right, inside of their communities, so.
Oh, you're talking about in gated communities where it's not just people with disabilities.
Correct.
And housing
A
authorities.
normal subdivision.
I got you.
One of
And
those
housing-
throw-up subdivisions in a, outside of a
It
city.
is, if a housing authority has a problem with that, it is discrimination.
Okay.
Under the Americans with
Perfect.
Disabilities Act. I'm sorry.
Awesome.
Got you
That's
there.
huge. Thank
Yes.
you very much.
Yes, and
That's big news.
Yeah, and I really do want to highlight that because the ARC has been part of actually several impact litigation around housing because of things like that, and it's really important if you do face issues with that. And if you're in Georgia, we've got a great chapter in the state of Georgia that I could always connect you with, but.
It'd be great. We'd love for them to be in the city or,
Yeah.
a lot of the ones in Georgia are kind of in rural areas.
Okay.
So it's kind of spread, the chapters anyway are
Okay.
kind of, yeah.
I think our state chapter's out of Atlanta, but yeah, we can
Yeah.
connect. But
That's
yeah.
awesome. Thank you
But
very
yeah,
much.
And certainly, because everyone has a right to belong in any community. And so if there is a situation where, because I can say this, and I should have said from the outset, I have permission to share my brother's story. And sometimes he's very loud, depending on what's going on in his life. And if we didn't have understanding neighbors, I know what that would look like. And so I certainly understand, but everyone has a right to live anywhere of their choosing. So yeah. Other questions on that? Okay. And so this is just a really good chart that my colleague TJ, who no longer works with us but is much smarter than me, but she put this up, and I think it really is helpful because it really breaks down the element that you need for each and where you can find it. So as far as the critical element, capital, so that's money, where you can get it. The housing authority in your state sometimes has specific funds. Sometimes counties even have specific funds set aside for housing development. Private foundation funds can also be used when you're talking about developing opportunities for housing. And there's some examples there. Low-income housing tax credits is a big one because, again, a lot of individuals with disabilities are forced into a state of poverty because it's better for benefits. And so there's things like that you can sometimes tap into, especially as family members, if you're taking a look at how to support them if you have some capital. As far as operating subsidy, that means who's going to actually work to build it. That's going to all come through the Housing and Urban Development Agency, but that will not. It's not like you'd be working directly with the federal government. You're going to be working with your state and local entities there. And then there's the support services that you need in order to live in the community, and that's what we talked about from the beginning. And that's where you're going to get that through the state Medicaid agency, and also the state. Generally, it's called the Developmental Disabilities Agency, but it's sometimes called the Mental Health Agency. It depends on what state you're in. But the Medicaid agency in a state talks about the funding. The DD agency actually helps with the services. So you really need to make sure that you're connected with both of those as well as your local or state housing authority. We also do have, one of the examples in there is the Money Follows the Person program. And the Money Follows the Person program is a program that expands the federal investment. So I talked about the fact that there are mandatory, that there's that match that is at least 50% of federal and state dollars. Well, some programs like the Money Follows the Person program invest more federal dollars in to create more opportunities for housing and more opportunities for services. And the Money Follows the Person program is one of those programs. It actually allows for the first time for Medicaid dollars to be spent on room and board. But just the first and last month's rent, because oftentimes if an individual is hospitalized or needs to, or is generally hospitalized or go to a rehabilitation stay or something like that, that first and last month's rent is also what keeps them stuck where they are. And so we do have programs, and we're going to continue to work where I am in Washington, D.C. to continue to pump funds. Actually, just a few weeks ago, an additional $180 million was set aside for housing. And this would be for housing under the Section 811 program. And now $150 million sounds like a lot, but when we're talking about the whole country, it's kind of a drop in the bucket. But it does show, and hopefully gives you a little bit of hope to know that Congress is paying attention to this issue and does know that we need to invest in capacity building. We need to invest in capacity building around actually creating the units. And then we're also working on things to get more funds into the community-based Medicaid funding, because we need to make sure that there's funds there so that it doesn't fall on families who are, we know that the majority of individuals with disabilities are living with family caregivers. And I know my parents, I know that that's not what my brother necessarily wants, or I know it's not what my brother wants. I also don't think that it's necessarily what my parents want either. And that's why we have to be able to continue to build capacity so that no families have to worry about what's going to happen. We want to make sure that not only do we have a place with a rental subsidy in place that we know is going to live past the person, and we also need to know that Medicaid is going to be there to fund the services. These are just, again, some things that you can do as far as advocating. It's really important to make sure that you know the housing authority in your state, and that you're on a lookout for them to see what they're building. Also, developers are really starting to get more in tune with what's going on, and so a lot of developers are taking a look at this and making sure that they know that in order, for example, to get Section 811 dollars, that there does have to be that mix and things like that. And so just make sure that you're out there, that you're a resource for disability issues. You don't have to be an expert on housing, you just have to be an expert on your own kid, but you have to make sure that you know what's out there. I purposefully left a lot of time for questions, so hopefully you have some. But also here is my email for things that come up as things go forward. I usually have a pretty good 24-hour rule depending on what's going on in Congress. But happy to answer questions about this or anything else that's going on in, well, maybe not anything else that's going on in Washington, D.C., but anything else that's going on in the policy space or anything else.
I had a question about what you've found works well. I know in our area, whenever they start to do any sort of building that, and I didn't even know it was called Section 811, because I'm from Maine, they just call it Section 8. But whenever they start building housing that is for disability, for low income, for seniors, there is an uproar in the community. We live in a rural area, and there is a lot of active opposition, particularly from business owners and wealthy members of the community, trying to push anything like that as far away from the town center as possible, because they see it as a blight, as a increase in all of the negative things that might happen in the community. Have you found anything that helps to assuage, to just make that a little bit less, to make it more appealing to,
Sure.
in some way?
Sure. So first, I just want to clarify, because there is Section 8. Section 8 is geared more towards low-income families, but Section 811 is the one that's more specifically designed for people with disabilities. I'm assuming you've dealt with that at some point? Yeah. I mean, I can cover it too, but I figured I'd
address it under discrimination.
Yes.
To be honest with you, that's the easiest and most common thing. It happens all the time. That's why people with disabilities live in group homes in the rural areas, because they can find the empty house on a court where nobody's in a development that's just being built, and they're going to get in there first. Some of the new rules, though, in urban areas are that when you're building new housing, there are rules that say that you actually have to have set-asides. And so in San Francisco, housing is astronomically expensive, but if anything's being built in San Francisco, they have to have set-aside apartments for people with disabilities and the elderly, and they have to be scattered because of the rules that have been coming through, and that's the law. The whole NIMBY, not in my backyard, actually I'm throwing an acronym out there, but not in my backyard issue is very common, but it's very common for a lot of reasons, for a lot of people, and it just goes right back to the ADA.
Yeah.
And what I would do is I'd take that to your protection and advocacy group in your area, because that's their job. Their job, federally mandated, is to advocate for people with disabilities, their rights, if they're being discriminated against in any way, shape, or form. And you don't have to pay for that attorney. So you don't have to go find your attorney who might be kicking you out into rural wherever you're going. That's exactly what I do. And if they know anything, all you have to do is know more, because they don't know what they're doing. And they've just got a lot of people that are screaming and hollering, and I would also get some community organizing going in, so that there are people that know how to get in contact with your local, who is at the local housing authority, who's in your mayor's office. There's usually a mayor's office with the Council of Disabilities. Is there, who else would I contact? Both the legislature, any of the legislators, senators down in that area, because nobody's going to say, we're just going to ignore the ADA. They're not going to do it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say as well, that there's the discrimination piece, and for the protection and advocacy organizations for folks who might not know, that is something that's required under federal law. It's very often, if you're in, wherever your home state is, it's very often disability rights blank, so disability rights California, disability rights Oregon. In my home state of Illinois, it's called Equip for Equality though, so it doesn't always make sense. Illinois likes to do things differently. But if you can go to the National Disability Rights Network, ndrn.org, and that's the national coalition of all of them, and so you can find what it's actually called in your state, but that's where you would go. But yeah, I mean, there is, because of the Americans with Disabilities Act, it would be a discrimination on that face, but if it sounds like you're talking about something that would be broader than just people with disabilities, and that gets complicated. But it's just as important to clarify, but it's a little bit less, and so what I would urge you to do is make sure that you're part of other intersectional groups that might also be facing the same things, to figure out how you can bring the disability voice into it, because it really is hard to, I mean, and I've done this because my brother likes to advocate, if you bring, this is when I was at the state level, bringing, your son or daughter and saying, so you can tell them yourself that you don't want them in your neighborhood, to city council meetings and stuff like that. I mean, it's horrible, and I can't believe in 2019 we're still having these conversations, but we are where we are.
I had a protection advocacy question. It's my understanding that they don't always take your case. If they feel like they've got, the manpower to do it, and if they feel like it's a worthy case, that they can devote that manpower to. So I don't know that you can just go, no, they don't have to take your case.
You just have to make sure that they're interested in it. So you probably need more than one case. Oftentimes we do class action suits, and we just get a whole group of us together that are representing the exact same thing. So you get the families. The ARC of California has sued the State Department of Developmental Disabilities twice and won. And we do that by just gathering plaintiffs and having the ARC or having a PAI or DRC file the suit. They need the notoriety. They want their check it off that we saved the disability community for this. But if you're talking about NIMBY, it's not happening just to you. It's happening to a lot of other people with disabilities, and you need to find who those are, and that's where community organizing comes in. You start talking to other people. We work in silos, but oftentimes when it comes to housing, the housing silo fits right next door to the aging silo, and right next door to the low income, and sometimes right next to the homeless, and rehab, and you've got all these silos, and they're not talking to one another. And so what you end up needing to do is some community organizing to get those groups talking to one another, and now you aren't just talking for one group. You have a huge group, and then you'd get DRC or PAI or whatever the group is to see that we have enough people here that this will probably make it worth our while.
Yeah, Pat, that's a fantastic point, because the protection and advocacy will very often maybe pass a one-off, but if you come in with 10 families, they're more likely to take the case. And it's not because they don't want to take every case, but yeah, bigger impact, more likelihood. Other questions?
I'm just going to pass it for anybody. You got another one? You're not allowed. You already did. Hold on. I'll come right back to you.
My question is, as a developer and a father of an Angelman child, we're looking at, possibly building a house for our child. Can you get rent assisted or rent lowering program if it's not actually a HUD house or a HUD complex. We've looked at doing HUD housing as well, but there's a lot of things that go along with that. But just in a regular residential area, is there rent assistance for something like that?
You could look into county-based funding, but anything that rental subsidies would have to be done through, any rental subsidies would be done through HUD, and anything would then have to be through a HUD development. But you might be able to look at, some counties do have funding for different specialty housing projects, especially for some of those protected classes. But and Pat just reminded me, and I should have, when I was starting out about talking about housing, kind of talked about the continuum of services, because I talked about funding already, we talked about some of the programs, but it's just also, so obviously some individuals with disabilities, including my brother right now, live at home with their parents, so that's one end of the continuum. And then I talked about institutional care, that's the most restrictive end of the continuum, and there's a lot of things in between. A lot of the things that we're talking about with building housing, that's going to be a lot of individual supports. Also, again, maybe with some Medicaid funded supports and services. There also are group homes. Group homes are called different things in different states. In my home state, again, Illinois is weird, but it's because of a law, but they're called SILAs. They're called different things in different states, so those do still exist. Group homes vary by size. What I will say is that while there's no restriction on size of group homes, a best practice has been found for no more than 4 individuals in a home. Those are still always going to remain an option, but it is going to be more and more difficult as things change and shift, and that's why it's really important to kind of know these housing kind of options, because you're going to be better off in the long term, again, if your housing is separated from those supports. But that can still happen in a group home settings, and that is still an option. So I just wanted to cover that as well. Other questions?
I keep hearing throughout the days previous and then today about the ARC and the national, and I know that in Maine there is no ARC. How do they expand, and why are they in some areas and not in others?
That's a 64,000.
Yeah, I was going to say, my CEO's not here right now. I mean, some of it just is based on where we had families that were starting chapters, because the majority of ARC chapters on some level at some point started as a group of families that were getting together to work on these issues. So some of it is just geolocation. I don't know the situation in Maine, but we are starting to work on branching out into states. We have state chapters in over 40 states, so we're in the majority of states, or more than the majority. But in states like Maine and Nevada, we sometimes have local chapters, but not necessarily a state chapter. I think in Maine we don't actually have any. But what we're doing, an example of what we're doing is we just started something in Rhode Island where it's a chapter of the ARC, but it's more of like a family resource kind of chapter. And so if you have an interest, if you're already, I'll make sure to give you one of my cards, because it doesn't take a lot to start a chapter of the ARC, and it's stronger. And Maine is I can't tell you how many times because of Senator Collins, that's always a target state, and I'm like, well, I can't do anything there, so if you have an interest, but the ARC does have over 600, almost 650 chapters all over the country. We do cover the majority of the country, but we do have those kind of holes, and we're definitely actively looking to fill them. We have state offices now in Arizona and Georgia and in Wisconsin, and what that means is they're actually employees of the national office, but they have their offices there. So we are working to make sure we have full coverage as well. But so if you have an interest, just let me know. Mm-hmm.
Kathy, we can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, thank you. So this will help like the people that live in my county in Michigan. The ARC of Bay County, they don't do anything.
Oh, I met you. I met you in March, and at the ARC of Midland event.
Oh, you were there. I knew I recognized you. So
Sorry.
then I probably shouldn't have been so blunt about my question, but I don't really care. The ARC of Bay County, they don't provide any services. They don't help families. They don't give seminars. What can we do about that? Because where I live rural, really rural. And families need assistance, and Bay County's not doing it. Is there anything we can do about that?
Well, we can talk more later, but I know what we actually are trying in that specific area, so I can use it as an example, because it's an example of two areas that are geographically touching. One has a very strong ARC program.
Correct.
And ARC support, and one doesn't.
Correct.
And so we are working to increase capacity. That means we have to raise money, and we're working on it. But to raise money so that strong chapter can absorb the chapter that's not as strong and actually support everybody. So we're working on it.
Okay.
It's like a merger.
Yeah, a merger, yeah. Did I see another hand over there? No?
Did you talk about Section 8 vouchers? Did we talk about Section 8 vouchers? No, I didn't. We don't really have them anymore.
Yeah, not really. Not
Okay.
even.
Well, I think there was a question about, subsidies. I think you asked in the back. And I know that very few states have them anymore, but sometimes a Section 8 voucher, just to get everybody more confused about Section 8, Section 811, and Section whatever. But I know that some people have Section 8 vouchers, which are portable within the area of your public housing authority. And that Section 8 voucher you can take to a willing renter, and they will be able to take whatever monies is on that voucher and be subsidized by the federal government. But it is a very restrictive program. They haven't opened up Section 8 vouchers in San Francisco for 20 years, so I'm not holding my breath. But Joseph is in Section 811 housing, but if he moved out of that, then he would have nothing. We'd have to start all over, either build another building, do a set-aside, find something else. So there used to be that program, but I really don't know any places who actually do that.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Ms. Bain?
I just wanted to clarify something. You said it's better if home and support are separated. Can you explain to me what that means again? I think you've already said it.
Sure, yeah, no problem. I mean, it's just that we've seen the movement. I mean, as we've talked about, the disability service industry has moved from institutions to where it is today. And so a recent movement has been separating services from supports. And so what that means is maybe one agency is helping provide the housing and then the other agency is providing the services. So that's an example. And it doesn't have to be true. Both can do both. It's just what we're seeing. More and more families are looking for that separation of where the housing is funded from versus where the services are funded from.
Kentucky just recently separated case management so that case management and service delivery can't be the same agency. And so part of it is accountability and things like that as well, so that you've got more eyes on and things like that.
Yeah, eliminating conflict of interest. And that's actually part of why Kentucky did that, is that's actually another more wonky component of the home and community-based settings rule.
Right.
Yeah. Other questions?
You know you've got another question. Okay.
I would actually say in Maine, they do the Section 8 vouchers. That's what they do. And I don't know if in your state that would be the case, but if you weren't a housing development through HUD, then you can become, if you are someone who owns rental property, you can go through the state to get approved for Section 8, and you have to have, the X number of fire extinguishers and all sorts of things to fill the requirements, but you can do that, at least in the state of Maine. They still do that. We're backwards in lots of ways, but, that has been helpful. It is beautiful.
Some do have it, but I don't know what state he was in, and it's really hard.
Yeah, it is a relatively underutilized program, whereas Section 811, they're growing. Yeah.
So I just wanted to clarify, when you talk about the housing continuum, is the goal to get, is the ideal, I should say, are we holding up the ideal that more people are able to stay in their homes and receive services in their homes, or at least in a family setting, as opposed to group home or more, obviously less institutional, but somewhere in that? Or are we looking more toward independence in in an apartment type situation?
So I would say there's no ideal. The ideal is going to be individualized. That's how everything should be. But whether from education to adult services, so I can't speak to an ideal. But what I will say is that I don't want to be pushing people to stay home without the services that they need. That's not going to help anybody in the long run. But what is going to help is to empower and encourage individuals and families to figure out what that level of independence looks like for them. So maybe it is an apartment on their own with staff coming in and supporting them. Maybe it is a basement in the family home where staff's coming in. Maybe it is a group home. So I don't want to say that we're pushing towards any way. We have chapters that are doing the full continuum. Well, not the full continuum, but that are supporting individuals in home, and also have group homes, but also supporting 10 people in 3 different apartment complexes. So the ideal should be that we continue, my view of the ideal is that we continue having enough funds for there to be capacity to fund everybody's ideal situation, as long as there's the ability to have community-based life, because that's what the families that started the ARC 70 years ago fought so hard for. So we don't want to see any going back on that, but the ideal is going to be individualized. I'm not here as a family member or as someone from the ARC to tell anybody what the best thing for their family member is, but it is about what we want as a society, and what we want as a society is to have people with disabilities being part of the fabric of our communities.
I think that, in speaking to that, if you were to try to build a 17-unit disability-only apartment building, there would probably be some problem with that, because that flies in the face of individuals. Unless, of course, they were going, well, no, 17 is going to be too high, no matter what you do with it. It's also building new group homes. I think group homes are starting to downsize across the country. You are starting to see them go from 6 to 4, and they'll have to make other accommodations in order to survive, because they're going to be individual leases, individual keys, individual decisions on who those roommates are. Those are the choices that they want individuals to be making a choice for. If you go into a group home, now, usually it's a 6-bed, it could be more. You wake up at 7:30, you are served breakfast that is made by some staff that you did not hire, you did not fire, and you get up and you are shipped off to some day program, because those people are off for the day, and then you get brought back at 3:30, 5 o'clock, whatever time it is, and they will serve you dinner by 6, and you're in bed, lights out at 8:30. There are no choice of pets, there are no choice of decorations on your room, there's no check of individualizing your room. It is done by the care provider of a group home, who in many cases are very wonderful people. There are also a lot of people that are in it for the money. And so when you look at family housing, foster housing, foster care, and those kinds of things, you really need to know what you're looking at, what you're screening for. Just like you were looking at a classroom, if a kid was going into a schoolroom, you'd go and you could look at that school and know for a second when those kids were really a part of that school or not a part of that school. Who are making the decisions here? Is the principal making the decision? Is it a special day class teacher? Are any of the students included in any of those decisions? Those are the same skills that you need to take as you move out of the school system and move into the adult world. You need to take those exact same screening thoughts into wherever you go. I would not want Joseph in a group home because of that institutional style of living. But there are a lot of places that is the only choice. And if I've got a 90-year-old father I'm taking care of, my mom just died of Parkinson's, at some point in time, I'm not going to be here, which I've said like 14 times today, I know. But, if I get ill, then, and this was my only opportunity, people have to do what they have to do, but then you're going to try and build the supports around that. But this is how the housing rules and funding are changing so that people will start to be prepared for the person-centered plan.
Yeah, and to Pat's point, I do think that I would say my friends that I advocate with who themselves happen to have disabilities would say that group homes are going to go the way of institutions, but institutions are still around, so that's how long it takes, I guess, would be. But I think that, we should be, and also I want to highlight that point that the ARC does not support settings where it's only people with disabilities living together, segregated away from the rest of the community, because that looks like a new institution. And so that's why HUD has requirements around scattering and that sort of thing. So I just want to highlight that as well. Any other questions?
I do think a lot of these things speak to the issue of advocacy, right? And so that's a part of our goal, is to get engaged in advocacy, whether that's going to be your thing or not, whether that's going to be the direction you take with your child, advocating for that spectrum to exist so that families have those choices to make. And I think whether it's the ARC or other national organizations that are doing that kind of advocacy, you very likely have something local or statewide that's doing advocacy. I told somebody earlier, we have something here in Louisville called the Council on Developmental Disabilities. Now, it's not a state council, it's a local nonprofit that works in this region, and they have a government advocacy arm, and then they have supports arms, and so they don't provide services. They become an incubator for new organizations to get started providing services and things like that. But you very likely may have something going on that you're not even aware of yet, that's going on the state or local level, that you can get involved in that advocacy. And I think it's important for all of us to, at whatever level we have capacity, to be a part of those advocating conversations.
Yep.
Another question here.
And advocacy is just telling your story. I know it can be intimidating. We train about 1,000 people every March and April to go, but you only have to know your life. You don't have to know all the data and all the numbers and all that stuff.
Is this a far-fetched idea? Right now, our daughter lives with us. Should we die, should we? When we die, can she continue to live in that home, have another person rent or roommate move into this home, and yet afterwards, would Medicaid or the state or however this works, own this home in any way, shape, or form?
No. So if you, for example, if you and your husband passed away and you decided that the best thing would be, so the lawyer in me says that it's more complicated, but which everything is. But you would. I don't know if you have guardianship over your daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have guardianship over your daughter, you would have to you'd have to find a substitute guardian that will come in after you're gone, whether it's a family member, and you would probably you'd want to also find a service provider who could act as the service provider, not owning the home, but to be the one that's providing the services that I would imagine you and your husband and other family members are doing now. But then whatever you decide to do financially with your home, whether it's tenancy by whatever it is, all my bad memories of law school are coming back, but whatever you decide to do with that.
Or a trust.
Or a trust, yeah, or a special needs trust, or however you do it, it would not be the state that you live in then when she passes away coming in and getting it. It would then go wherever the rest of that trust remainder was going. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Tomorrow at 8:30, there's a session on special needs trusts and things like that, so great way to protect assets, especially. 8:30 tomorrow, I think, is when Bonfire says it's on. And whatever Bonfire says has to be true. Although it hasn't been true never mind.